Hi everyone, this is the 2025 Paper 1 A-Level Business Preview. In this video we're going to go through the basics of Paper 1, what to expect. We're going to do a very brief visit on exam question structure, talk a little bit about kind of the main tips for success, the main things you need to make sure you get right in this exam. Then the main part is we're going to look at content, topics from previous years. We're going to look at the calculations that could come up and the calculations that have come up in previous years, and then finally we're going to go through some of the key links between themes 1 and 4. So these are the Paper 1 basics. Paper 1 basics, to be honest, this bit's going to be repeated in Paper 2 because the papers in terms of structure are exactly the same, Paper 1 and 2. You have 2 hours, you have 100 marks, it is split into 2 sections. So Section A and Section B are both worth 50 marks each. Both are 4 marker, 4 marker, 10 marker, 12 marker, 20 marker. The idea here is that because there's 2 sections in 2 hours, you should be trying to do 1 section in 1 hour. So I would think about it as 2 separate papers. If you do a mark a minute, so 50 marks, 50 minutes, that gives you 10 minutes spare. You're probably going to need that for the 10 and 12 markers because they take a little bit longer. But you're also going to use that as part of your planning time and as part of reading the case study. So really important that you get your timing right. We'll touch more on that a little bit later on. You're given 2 sets of extracts. There's 1 for each section. Now, in Paper 1, typically what you tend to see, not always, but you tend to see the first section being more Theme 1 based, the second section being more Theme 4 based. So there's a bit more of a split. On Paper 2, it's not quite like that. So that's kind of what you should kind of expect. But the key thing here is what that means for the case studies, because it more likely means that your second case study is going to be for a more global business. It's going to involve different countries and things like that. So consider how you're going to approach the case studies. My advice would be read the section first and then read the case study and try and identify which extracts or sections are likely to be linked to each question. We'll talk about that more when I do the case study bit a little bit later on, but that's how I would do it. Some prefer to read the case study first and then look at the questions. I just think that's maybe a bit inefficient because you're going to end up having to read the case study more than once. So structure, I'm going to get rid of myself here, so I know I'm in the way of the 20 marker bit there. Structure-wise, you've got your 4 markers, your 10 and 12 markers, which we're going to group together, and your 20 markers. 4 markers, you've got 3 different types. You've got an explain how question, which is your kind of more common 4 marker. You'll probably have 2 of these, I would imagine. And these are point-based marks, so you get a mark for a good point, you get a mark for a bit of analysis, and you get 2 marks for application. So really important in your 4 markers that you get 2 bits of application in there. They've got to be 2 separate bits. For a construct question, that would be drawing a supply and demand curve. So you just draw the supply and demand curve. And for a calculate question, you do a calculation. I would guess you'll probably get 2. 1 maybe could be a construct or 2 calculations. In all of the exams that we've had previous, we've at least had 2. In some cases, we've had 3 that have involved some sort of calculation. For a 10 and 12 marker, I know that one's worth 10 and one's worth 12. To be honest, there's an extra analysis mark and there's an extra evaluation mark. I don't think that's necessarily worth doing an extra paragraph. A few people will talk about doing like a second each paragraph. For the extra 2 marks, I don't necessarily think that's worth it. I think you're better off kind of treating the structures as the same. So I would start with a definition. It's an optional. You don't need a definition. It does help to kind of get you in the right frame of mind for the question and make sure the examiner knows beyond doubt that you know the key term. Then you want 1 each paragraph. Now this has to be balanced. So if it's an impact question, assess the impact, you would have to do positive and negative impact. Your negative would be the however. If it's important, you would do a reason why it is important, however, a reason why it's not important. Value would be valuable, however, not valuable. It goes kind of like that. If you've got your however, you don't need a second paragraph for your negative. Okay, your however is the negative. So you get your balance from that 1 paragraph. That's the whole point of Peach, is it ends in however. When I came up with that, it literally was, we need to start with a P for point, we need to have an A in there for apply, and we need to have a H for a however at the end. What words can we use that might kind of hit that criteria? For your conclusions, you need a conclusion in a 10 and 12 marker. All the essay questions on this paper need a conclusion. I'll talk more about conclusion structure in a little while. 20 markers seem scary. I actually think they're pretty straightforward in terms of structure because it is just 2 options. You argue for and against each option, and then you make a decision at the end. Now, the key thing here with these paragraphs is you still need to have the negatives in there. You can't just do for option 1 and against. For option 1 and for option 2. You need to have the evaluation in there throughout. That's where your however's come in. You need to argue for both, and then you make your decision at the end with your conclusion. One thing worth bearing in mind is you don't want your against option 1 to be your for option 2. So, for example, if it's share capital, well, that would be a theme 2 one. So, if, for example, if it was primary or secondary market research, your against for your primary research section shouldn't be the benefits to secondary. It should be the weaknesses of primary. So, the last thing to think about there is that sometimes these questions have a focus. So, for example, it might say, is it about increasing profit? Is it about increasing market share? And then you need to make sure you link back to that in your answer. So really important that you get your structure right for that question. Conclusions. This is the structure I kind of like to use. I don't necessarily know if you need all 4 sections of this in every single conclusion. You definitely need the first 3. The most important point can be just something that helps you elevate your answer a little bit further. So make your choice clear, first and foremost. Positive, negative impact. Try and use the words of the question. Justify the main reason for your decision. You want to try and avoid just repeating the point you've already made, but you need to justify why you've made that decision. Does it depend on anything? So, for example, if you've offered a negative to primary research, could you say, for example, if primary research is going to be time-consuming or costly, could you say that it depends on whether they can, whether the information they get is valuable enough that it's worth the money, or is there it depends on whether there's a way that they can potentially make it cheaper. Any kind of it depends on points is really, really useful. And then the last bit is the most important point. And for this, I think it's really good practice to consider the MOPs of the business. So MOPs, when we talk about MOPs, we're referring to market, objectives, product, service, and situation. So look at the table there to just get a few examples of what I mean by that. So market is, what market are they in? Are there a lot of competitors? Is the market growing? Is the market kind of stagnating? What are the objectives? What's the business trying to achieve? They don't always necessarily tell you this, but you can make some judgments based on what information you've got. If it's a business trying to, like in the case that it's expanding, then quite clearly their goal is to expand. Product or service, is it high quality? Is it low cost? Are they targeting the mass market or the niche market with that? And then situation, has anything significant happened? Have they had any issues? Has there been like a change to the business? Anything that's in the case study there potentially could be used to make your most important point. So definitely worth having a look at that in your conclusion. The MOPS bit will also help you develop your analysis as well, potentially. So it's definitely worth just having in the back of your head as you're going through these questions. Right, so attacking the case studies. Application is such an important part of this, and this is kind of what I would do with the case studies. So this is an example of a section A, and I've written down bullet-pointed versions of what the questions were. So there was one on percentage growth, one on the product life cycle, and they both referred to extract A in the question. And there was a question on stock market flotation, one on a dynamic market, and then there was an Ansop's matrix question, which was about market penetration or product development versus market development. And so, as you can see, when I went through this case here, I read the questions first, made a note of what the questions were about, and then I highlighted them in colours to try and get an idea of like which bits you could use for which question. The ideal would be have one of these. They are not the sponsor of this video, but they should be, the amount of times I advertise them to my students. One of these pens with 4 different colours. As you can see here, that's what I've done on here to try and demonstrate this. I've gone for black for the 2-4 markers. I've gone for red for the 10 marker, blue for the 12 marker, and green for the 20 marker. It just helps you visibly be able to kind of see what you've got for each case study there. The reason this is helpful is because if you think about it, that hour is going to be split up quite neatly, and if you get your timing right, there's certain things you're not going to come back to until potentially 40 minutes through the exam. Let's have a look at that visualized. If you look at it like this, and you've got 60 minutes, so this is just for one section, right? If we assume we're going to use that first 10 minutes for our kind of annotating the case study, let's look at how the rest of it breaks down. Assuming we're going to go mark a minute, right? You're going to have the 4 markers there. That's going to take about 8 minutes. Then you're going to have the 10 marker, then the 12 marker, and then the last 20 minutes is going to be the 20 marker. And this is why that first few minutes is really, really important. Reading the questions and annotating the case study, you're not going to come back to that 20 marker until 40 minutes into the exam, or obviously for the second half, an hour and 40 minutes in. And so you're going to have to look back at the case study, and you don't necessarily want to have to do that and read the whole thing again and again. Whereas if you annotate the case study from the beginning, then it means that, like, effectively, then when you go back at the beginning of that 20 marker and you check back through the case study, you're only looking at the bits they highlighted in that colour. That way, it just breaks it down, and it hopefully makes it easier for you to plan. It also makes it easier for you to get your application, because that's really, really important. Key tips for success. I've touched on a few of these already, but this is the task you've got ahead of you, basically. These are the 4 main areas where people struggle. Timing goes without saying. It's quite tough to get your timing right. So therefore, make sure you're focused on it all the way through. Make sure you're thinking, right, this is a 10 marker. I want to try and get this done in 10 minutes. My advice would be, you can't take watches in, because kind of smartwatches ruined that for everyone, where you can get so much information on a watch. When I used to do exams, I used to take my watch off and I used to just put it on my desk and I would look at the clock all the time. You can still do that. Your exam hall has to have a clock in it. So if you know you're starting a 10 marker, look at the time, make a mental note, right? Okay, it's 9:13. I'm going to finish this by 9:23. And if you micromanage your timing like that, it does help you stay on track. The last question on the paper is a 20 marker. If you find that you're in a position where, you run out of time for that question or you don't finish it, that is 20% of the marks. Like, it is, you can't afford to lose that. You can't afford to waste that time. So you've got to make sure you get your timing right. I've had students in the past who've done the sections in like a different order. So they've done like the 20 marker first, then the 12, then the 10, then the 4s. So that if they did run out of time and miss a 4 marker, they missed instead. And there's pros and cons to that. The benefit is you get your 20 markers done at the beginning of the sections. The downside is a 4 marker. Sometimes they're a really easy way to get 4 full marks. It's going to be harder to get 20 out of 20. The one thing I would recommend though is not jumping from one section to the other. Don't do both 20 markers, because then you're reading all the case studies at the beginning. You need to stick to it, section A, section B, because those case studies are going to be used for potentially multiple questions. And so it's really important that you build that kind of, like, the idea is you answer a bunch of questions about the same business. It builds you up knowledge-wise. Application we've touched on. Make sure you use the case study. You need it in every single question. Your answers are going to be pretty average if you don't have application. In fact, they're going to be below average. Structure, we've talked about already what the structure is. Don't overdo it. You don't want to spend too much time writing 2 full paragraphs with howevers and then find you don't have time for a conclusion, because it's going to limit your marks factually. And then knowledge as well. Look, goes without saying, it's an A-level exam. Like, you need to know the content, you need to know the key terms. I'm going to touch more on some knowledge bits in a minute. So this is the exam content, and these are the topics that have come up in previous years. This is what is on the paper. So paper 1 is theme 1 and theme 4. I would imagine you already all know that. Let's go through it in a bit more depth. So let me hide myself again. This is what's come up on different papers over the past few years. So we're going back to 2017, which is the first edition of this A-level paper. And I've got another one of these for theme 4 as well. I'm not in the business of making guesses, really. I think predictions is just a way to kind of short your revision and take risks, and I don't necessarily think it's worth it. I would look to see certain topics have come up every couple of years, and so it's worth paying attention to those. And then there are some topics that haven't come up for a while, which maybe are worth just having a little bit of a look at. I would be in particular looking here at... Oh, so by the way, just to explain, if it's 1 in shaded in blue, that means it came up on paper 1. Obviously, paper 3 covers all 4 themes, so you could get some theme 1 stuff in paper 3 as well. So I've put those in here, so you can see which ones have come up in paper 3, just so you know that whether they've been assessed, even if it wasn't on paper 1. There's a few times where there's been a little bit of theme 2, paper 2, where there's just been topics, other questions that have just had a bit of a link to a theme 1 topic. I think there's an example of motivation there in 2020. Looking at this, I think, supply and demand has come up 3 times on paper 1. They haven't assessed it on the last 2 years. They had a demand-based question on paper 3, but it wasn't a supply and demand curve. So maybe there's a chance you get a supply and demand curve on paper 1 this year. I would look price elasticity of demands come the last 2 years. Maybe that means it's less likely. I wouldn't want to be taking that risk though by not revising it. And the other thing I would look at really is probably the beginning of 1.4 and all of 1.5 really. There hasn't been anything from 1.4.1, 2 or 3 for a while on paper 1. It's been assessed on papers 2 and 3, but not in the last 2 years. And there's always a 1.4 topic. It's appeared every other year. The last section as well, 1.5, roles of the entrepreneur, entrepreneurial motives and characteristics. We haven't had that for a couple of years. We haven't had much on kind of objectives and strategies and stuff like that there. We haven't had, well, we had a forms of business question on paper 3 last year, but not on paper 1. Opportunity costs and trade-offs hasn't been assessed for a few years. It's been a 3-year gap. Last time it came up, it was after a 3-year gap. So there's some things worth potentially having a look at there. But again, I wouldn't go too much into projections and things like that. I think you're setting yourself up for failure if you just revise certain things because they haven't come up for a while. For theme 4, I can reappear here, can I? Yeah, I'm not in the way of anything there. Maybe I'm in the way of your focus, but we'll let that go. Studies have shown that apparently it's easier to track these videos when there's a face and a mouth you can kind of watch along with. So that's why I'm in the corner of these here. What I would be looking at here for theme 4 is probably 4.1. Not really much on 4.1 last year, and that's a huge topic. As you can see, it's been assessed in pretty much every other year in some way. So I'd definitely be having a look at 4.1. But theme 4 is not that long, so definitely worth having a look at in general. 4.4, they've assessed 4 times in the last 5 years after not assessing at all for the first 3. Again, maybe there's nothing to this. I just thought it was worth sharing. In terms of calculations, these are the different potential calculations that you can get. So there's a few in 1.1, market share and market growth. Some of them are just going to be general percentage changes. You could get a percentage change in terms of market pricing. Supply and demand curves and price and income elasticity demand are the main ones from 1.2. And then in theme 4, you can get a little bit on things like population data, taxation, and exchange rates. I've put a few little formulas on the screen here. I'm not going to go through supply and demand curves, and there's plenty of resources on supply and demand curves out there, and it would take a bit of time to go through it in this, and I've got quite a lot to get through. But I've put the price elasticity and income elasticity demand questions on there. The one thing you'd have to be aware of is you might have to calculate percentage change to find those numbers, so percentage change in quantity over percentage change in price, or percentage change in quantity over percentage change in income. You might need to do a percentage change calculation to find that. Percentage change comes up quite a lot. I mean, let's have a look at what's come up in previous years. So this is all of the exams that we've had. What you'll notice is there's quite a lot of just general percentage questions. I mean, general percentage growth, percentage change. The market share questions are pretty much percentage questions. Supply and demand curves, as we mentioned, have come up 3 times, but not in the last 2 years. Price and income elasticity of demand has come up quite a bit in the last 2 years. So I would make sure you know your percentage changes, and I would make sure you read the questions carefully, because they're not just going to chuck a general percentage change question in an A-level exam. It's going to be a bit specific. They're going to ask you to work out the difference between 2 things or something like that. My advice would be, go back through these papers and have a look at the calculations. You know, it shouldn't take you more than 2 hours to probably go through all of those and give them a try, and you'll figure out if there's any that you can't do. If you can do all the ones that have come up in previous years, you should be in a pretty good place for what's going to come up this year. I would guess this is probably going to be 2 4 markers, as you can see, pretty much all of the years except for last year, it's been 2 4 markers. And then the one last year, actually, was it 2020 or 24? It might have been last year, where it was, one of them was actually a calculation that you could do to help you with a 4-mark writing question. It was just part of the application, so worth bearing in mind those little things. In terms of key topics, what I've done here is I've gone through and I've just highlighted some of the key topics that I think are worth giving a little bit of extra focus to. I think what I've tried to do really is look at the ones that I think are the most kind of fundamental, but also ones that might have some specifics that you might have forgotten, like particular models. So all of 1.2 is worth looking over again. Supply and demand, not just the diagrams, but also what affects supply and demand. Price and income elasticity, definitely worth looking at as well. Could come up as an essay if it doesn't come up as a calculation. But I've listed product service design just because I think it's really important to know the design mix, and you know, it's just a model that I think is worth recapping. Marketing strategy, you've got 2 there. You've got the Boston Matrix and you've got the product life cycle, both worth having a look at. And then forms of business, making sure you know the differences between all of your kind of sole traders, partnerships, franchises, private and public limited companies. And then 4.1, 4.3 and 4.4 are both really short. Important, but really short. 4.1 and 4.2 are the kind of bulk of theme 4, really. 4.1 is looking at what causes globalization and linking to more trade. And then protectionism. Look, I mean, if you've been paying attention to the news, protectionism has been all over the news at the minute in the last few months because of Donald Trump and his tariffs on pretty much everyone and everything. The exam paper was written a long time before that, so you're not going to see anything about Donald Trump's protectionism. Well, It's not out of the realms of possibility. It might be a link from the previous Trump era, but it's still a really important topic to be aware of. Trading blocks as well, having a lot of relevance at the moment. And then 4.2.2 and 4.2.3, we've seen loads of questions about this, where you see a business that is choosing a country. Really nice for a 20 marker, because it gives you that straight choice of this country or this country. It could be Europe or Asia. It could be Africa or North America. It could be anything like that. And you need to think about whether they're trying to be targeting a market or a production location. So again, I'm not going to do full revision on these here because I've got recap videos for the entire course on the channel anyway. I'll make sure that they are linked at the end of this video and in the description. So I would certainly recommend, I'd have a look at all of it. It's an A-level, like, you've got to study it all, but those are the bits that I would maybe specifically focus on. Finally, let's go through some links between Theme 1 and Theme 4. There's a reason Theme 1 and Theme 4 are assessed together. Let's try and kind of get an idea of how some of the marketing stuff from Theme 1 links to some of the stuff that's in Theme 4. If you've watched any of the previous Paper 1 previews, this is reasonably similar to those. I imagine you might not have, though, because obviously you didn't do the exams last year, and so you probably didn't watch the previews for last year's. But just on the off chance that before a mock you've watched this bit, this bit is pretty much the same as it was in previous years. So I'm going to go through it, but it's just worth mentioning that, like, you know, this stuff I've done before in previous videos. So if you've already watched them, then that's fine. So we've got marketing strategy on a global scale. Marketing strategy comes up in 1.3, and then there's global marketing in 4.3. So we'll talk about some of that. We've got people management on a global scale. So 1.4, thinking about global labor markets, thinking about recruitment selection, and how recruitment just looks totally different in different countries for a whole range of reasons. And we've got the ethics in managing people and in marketing. So ethics, global ethics. Ethics is a Theme 3 topic. Global ethics comes up in Theme 4 as well, as a way of allowing them to assess these kind of bits as well. Okay, so marketing strategy on a global scale. We've got 3 different approaches that we think about, that we study in Theme 4, and they affect the entirety of the marketing mix. So we've got ethnocentric, polycentric, and geocentric. So let's go through what these 3 mean and look at an example of each. So ethnocentric is the belief that your approach will carry over into any market. Now, sometimes this is if your marketing and your brand is based around you being from a particular country. So, for example, a business like Burberry, where they're a British brand, and the kind of esteem about the brand is that they're British. If you changed that when you went to different countries, it wouldn't necessarily it would lose its appeal. So they kind of keep the same marketing approach across all countries. Netflix more modernly have adopted this approach too. They have a pretty much consistent offer in terms of they don't really adapt their range of titles for different countries, and they have a pretty consistent pricing strategy worldwide, despite the fact that obviously incomes are vastly different in different countries. Their kind of perspective on this is that like, for example, they do have, you know, if you take Asia, for example, or like Indian movies or Bollywood movies, they do have those, but they typically choose the ones that they think are going to have like a more global reach. So they're not really like going out there and making customized content specifically just for Asian markets. Whatever they put out is going to be globally on Netflix. So they kind of have that same approach everywhere, which means that they've got quite this ethnocentric approach. That's good in the sense that it allows them to save costs. They don't have to do all that huge different levels of amendments. They don't have to do massive amounts of marketing. Different marketing for different places. Polycentric is the opposite of this. Polycentric is where you adapt your marketing for every single market. Now, this is the case with Nestle. I've used the example of Kit Kat there because I think in the UK we've got what we got. We've got Kit Kat, we've got Kit Kat Chunky, the white Kit Kats, might have the like peanut butter ones. If you go on Wikipedia and you search Kit Kat in Japan, they've got hundreds of different versions of Kit Kat. So it's just an interesting example of how like they can adapt their product vastly just for different markets, and they do this all over the world. So it's really interesting just as an example how they change so much of their product for different countries to take advantage of local tastes and trends. Geocentric is the more mixed approach, the middle of the road approach, and what they'll do is they'll try and have as much of their branding and marketing that is consistent, but they will make adaptations. So if you take, for example, someone like McDonald's or Domino's, the branding's the same, the logo's the same, the stores will probably look very much the same, but they will make changes to their pricing strategy. They'll make changes to their product range. Like there's different pizzas on offer in different countries. There's different types of burgers on offer in different countries based around their kind of local requirements. So ethno, poly, and geo, worth making sure you're aware of those three key terms. And it links to the marketing mix. So the 1.3 link to 4.3. Entering new global markets, you've got to decide on what you're going to do with your market mix. Especially if you're trying to be geo or poly, you've got to change some of these things. And so these are the kind of different things you've got to have to think about for your market mix in a bit more depth. So is the product going to be adapted to suit different tastes or requirements? I'd give an example of like Coca-Cola, for example, changed their way that they package their products because in certain countries they don't drink as much soft drinks as they do in other countries. I was recently in America on a school trip. We had an Easter holiday trip, and I remember one of the main things that stood out was just like how much like fizzy drink they drink. Like their large is like an extra large in England. So changes to sizes have an impact in different countries. Prices will have to be amended depending on different income levels. The place, like thinking about how easy it is to get products around, thinking about transportation and infrastructure, whether it's easy to get your products to little stores. Where do people buy their products? Coca-Cola, for example, in the UK, people buy their groceries from supermarkets, and so the main place they'd want to be is in supermarkets. In other countries, like in India, for example, people go to smaller little markets rather than like small little market stores, and more localized rather than go and like drive into the big supermarket kind of thing like we do. So the other thing is e-commerce and online access. So like, I mean, you take, for example, Netflix trying to get into India. In India, there's actually, despite the fact the population is absolutely massive, there's actually quite a small number of people who have got like access to broadband and can actually do streaming. Less than 20 million, and the population is 1.4 billion. So just you've got to take into consideration infrastructure in terms of like access to the internet and things like that as well. And then the promotion has to be suitable for different audiences as well. So we've seen plenty of examples where businesses have had to adapt, like in particular for clothing brands, because of like religious clothing and different kind of like cultures, opinions on modest dress and things like that. So we've seen plenty of businesses having to adapt their promotion. We've seen businesses like Nike and sports brands starting to try and use kind of like local athletes in their promotion in different countries to try and appeal. And for example, I mean, we would look at in England, for example, like a cricket player is not going to be a global household name, but in India, like the cricket players are the biggest athletes going. So thinking about things like that is really important as well. Differences in tastes. This is less of a factor when you're thinking about luxury brands, like someone like Apple, for example. The brand is so powerful that people will want it, and they'll want it to be the way it was. Similarly, like with some of those that I mentioned, British brands earlier, people want that brand that way, so there's not going to be as much adaptation. But you do have to take into consideration things like from McDonald's, like attitudes towards certain meats, and this obviously carries over to a lot of religious stuff as well. So attitudes towards different meats, attitude towards different foods, and things like that will have a big impact on the products that maybe are on offer. In terms of global labour markets, we've got a few factors here. There is skill shortages in certain countries. This, like the level of education is really, really important. Educational standards have a massive impact on how many skilled workers there are, and then that has an impact on whether people can get jobs in primary, secondary, or tertiary industry businesses, and then that has an impact on wage rates. The key thing, we'll talk about ethics in a second, but the key thing with wage rates is that obviously it's cheaper to produce in certain countries, and so the labour market's vastly different. It's why we've seen quite a lot of production being moved out of the UK, because it's just so much cheaper in terms of wages to produce these things in different countries. We've also got to think about the trade-off between high standards and low labour rates. So we might want lower wages for our workers so we can save some money and make more profit, but there is potentially going to be an impact on quality there if the workers aren't as skilled. In terms of recruitment and selection, I'm going to remove myself because I've accidentally put myself right over the BT logo. In terms of recruitment and selection, we've got the differences in terms of legal procedures and requirements across different countries. So legislation's different, and that has an impact on businesses when they're recruiting and when they're selecting workers. and also just generally on them keeping workers. And then we've also got the potential to outsource or offshore production. So just to make sure you know the difference between these two terms, outsourcing is where you pay another company to do something for you. So you don't do it anymore, you pay them to do it for you. And offshoring is when you still do it, but you do it elsewhere. So BT, for example, have had plenty of examples of both of these, where in particular they offshored a lot of their customer service to different countries because wage rates were much cheaper. They did it themselves, but they did it in a different country. Marketing approaches then have to be considered as well. So think about like whether some products may become more niche market, more mass market. So attitudes towards alcohol is a big factor. It's a niche market product in certain countries where there isn't great deals of alcohol consumption. Attitudes towards animals is a big factor as well. I can't remember the example, but I remember reading about an example of a business that had a bunch of like dogs in their advert, just kind of like, you know, being part of a family is the Western kind of like culture. And in the country they showed the advert, people were like really confused because in their country most dogs are just stray animals that just wander the streets. Attitudes towards style of dress, really important as well. I remember reading about I think it was a Nike or a Reebok advert involving some like beach volleyball players that was shown worldwide and had to be pulled because it didn't kind of conform to different standards in terms of like modest dress and things like that. We've talked about this already a little bit when we talked about labour practices, but ethics is a really, really important factor. There's a lot of ethical issues around labour, around sweatshops, around child labour, around slave labour, around people not being given kind of like fair working conditions. Nestle have had loads of pressure from pressure groups and from customers. There's been a big Nestle boycott for a variety of reasons over the years. One of them is because of the fact that they have so much child labour or alleged child labour at their farms in different countries. Now, the key thing here is like they are using farms that might not necessarily be owned by them. Are they responsible for the ethics and the fair treatment of their workers for the companies? You know, that's a conversation you could have loads of times. I don't have fixes for these things, by the way. If I did, I would obviously have probably a Nobel Peace Prize, and instead of that, I'm teaching business at a school in Ipswich. So, you know, I don't have fixes to these things, but these are the issues that we need to be aware of. There is obviously a trade-off between fair treatment of workers and profit, because fair treatment of workers is going to increase costs. That's going to take away from profit. And then there's also like legal requirements as well. So them being different in different countries. Does that make it difficult for a business to know what is fair in different markets? And then lastly, just the impact of this on reputation. So Primark's had a long-running reputation for having poor treatment of workers, and that's had an impact on their reputation overall. Some people can look at the prices and think, oh, well, you know, this is only a few pounds, this is a really good deal, but sometimes you've got to question whether it's worth it when you think about if you know the background behind that. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview as to what to expect from Paper 1. Hopefully that's not too long. You've managed to watch all the way through. If you've got any Paper 1 specific questions, chuck them in the comments. There will be a Paper 2 video and a Paper 3 video. The Paper 3 one's obviously going to be in a different format because the Paper 3 one's going to be based on the pre-release. But the Paper 2 one will probably come, well, depends on when you're watching this really. I'm planning on doing it a couple of weeks in advance. So hopefully these are useful. Have a look at some of the resources in the description, and if you've got any questions, give me a shout. Thank you very much for listening.